We're closer to World War III than we've been in quite some time, but the chances of it happening are still pretty low. And the most pressing reason why we won't go to war will be at the end of this post. Starting off, I know everyone is afraid of North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia, but why? When both world wars were fought in the 20th century, it was among nations that had a competitive military force and industry. World wars were between the most developed nations on the planet, including the United States, Canada, and Japan. Yes, there were dozens of other countries that fought in the war, but it was led by the most powerful ones. And both sides of this war had a fairly equal chance of winning. Let's compare the strength between the two sides of this war. There's the United States with 750 military bases all over the world, and by far the largest military budget. And despite everything you're hearing in the news, if any country had the audacity to attack a member of NATO, which is the US's key alliance, the entire 32 country group would attack as one. Remember that Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China do not make the best weapons in the world. They merely copy NATO countries, which make the best weapons. Russia has some good stuff on their own, but that's few and far in between. NATO also has the best trained troops on the planet, and that includes special forces. Name anything comparable to the British SAS or the Navy SEALs. And yes, the Russian Spetsnaz are scary, but they're not very effective if you've read any of the stories where they had to involve themselves in counterterrorism operations. But the West does have one large vulnerability because of the United States. We have Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense, which is the most powerful office to be held in the Pentagon, and he can't seem to keep his chats on secured devices, which means China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea could possibly infiltrate and find a lot of great intel to use against us. But that does nothing to address the key vulnerabilities of those four countries. Russia, which was supposed to be the world's most second powerful military, can't even conquer one country, Ukraine. In fact, they've been trying for 3 years and they have lost almost 1 million troops. They've already switched to a full wartime economy and it hasn't done anything to turn the tide. If Poland alone joined Ukraine, Russia would lose. What about North Korea, who has been supplying Russia with troops and weapons? They are still recovering from the famine in the 1990s and they also still have massive food shortages. If the West ever really wanted to fight North Korea, all they would have to do is start airdropping the soldiers food, and there'd be a revolution like that. And while China and North Korea helping Russia against Ukraine isn't a good thing, just remember the USSR sent military advisors, planes, equipment, and even pilots in North Vietnam to attack American soldiers and equipment. So there were Russians in Russian-made planes killing Americans in Vietnam War. Did that escalate to World War III? What about Iran, who is supplying Russia with Shahed drones and missiles? You mean the Iran that's asking to come back to the negotiating table with the United States right now, who has been getting attacked by other countries repeatedly and doing very little to retaliate? That Iran? The United States has aircraft carriers not too far from this country, just waiting for them to do something stupid. Iran got the message and they're scared. Last but not least is the world's second largest economy and the US's number one rival on the planet. In fact, China has the largest economy if you include PPP, which is purchasing power parity. But there are a lot of shortcomings to that measurement. But I'll give it to them. They have number one there. And do not buy that statistic of them only spending $250 billion on the military. It's closer to $700 billion a year. And remember what I said earlier about in World War I and World War II, it was mainly the most developed economies that were fighting. China is the only country in that potential axis of evil that is developed enough. But China is struggling with deflation, which is one of the most deadly things that can happen to an economy as large as China. Despite the hundreds of billions, if not over $1 trillion of government assistance towards the economy, they are still struggling with prices dropping. It sounds very nice, but it means that there is not enough export or internal consumer demand for Chinese produced goods. It's leading to poor consumer sentiment and, of course, increasing unemployment. Despite these shortcomings, China has a great deal of leverage over the US economy because they're holding over $700 billion of government debt and they're sitting on at least $1.5 to $2 trillion in cash and US equities. And while the Chinese people can endure more of an economic constriction, they are still being hurt by the Trump tariffs. That's why China walked back on that 125% tariff against a bunch of US goods. Even though China is ready and willing to fight for what it has to, they are desperate to have things go back to business as usual. They want the rest of the world to be prosperous enough to buy their goods, because that is how the Chinese economy gets to keep expanding. And if China does anything that can be considered an act of aggression to its rivals or its neighbors, then they lose a lot of trade. And they also lose this new and budding relationship with South Korea and Japan as to how to deal with the United States tariffs. So yeah, China can't do anything too spooky because they could be tariffed by all of Southeast Asia, not just the United States. Then there's China's number one weakness with being the world's largest importer of food and energy. If we actually went to war with them, all we would have to do is blockade, make sure no grain, no oil came their way, and they would internally collapse. I know you all loved those reasons, but the number one reason why I don't think there's going to be a World War III is that there is one dynamic that has completely changed 180 since World War I and World War II, and that is our population growth. During World War I and World War II, we were terrified about overpopulation. The opposite is true now. China, Russia, Iran, Japan, even the United States without immigration, we are witnessing a population decline. We are having less than 2 children per family, so we don't even have enough people to keep the population flat. In fact, by 2086, the world's population is projected to peak and then to start dropping. Another crushing disadvantage that all of these countries have is that we don't have enough of a young population to support the growing older population. Except maybe India. India's got this down well for now. None of these countries can afford to have large chunks of their population just cut out, because then that just exacerbates the decline. And you guys might be thinking, well, what about drone warfare? Then there won't be as many soldiers fighting. Yeah, but what will the drones be blowing up, attacking, and destroying? People. Right now, only one country has been dumb enough to throw their population into the meat grinder. China and Iran are not that stupid. So instead of some massive, potentially apocalyptic world war, I think we're going to see a series of these small skirmishes between unidentified parties trying to fulfill their government's interests. I am the Geo Husar, and I think peace will prevail. Thanks for watching.